As he said, even if it seems small, there's usually something you can do if you are looking for it. You can defend the truth. You can defend democracy. You can lift up others. And toward the end of his life, he said, I am begging the American people to pay attention to what is going on. Because if you want to have a democracy intact for your children and your children's children and generations yet unborn, we have got to guard this moment. This is our watch. Our Elijah knew, because he was a man of faith and a man of the church, that life was fleeting and precious. And that's why he worked so hard to make every moment of his life count. When we're dancing with the angels, the question will be asked, he said, in 2019, what did we do to make sure we kept our democracy intact? I will end with the paraphrase of a poem that Elijah recited in his very first speech in the Congress. He said that he told himself this poem as many as 20 times a day. I only have a minute, 60 seconds in it. Forced upon me, I did not choose it, but I know that I must use it. Give account if I abuse it, suffer if I lose it. Only a tiny little minute, but eternity is in it. Thank you, Elijah Cummings, for your work, your service, and the lessons you leave us. God bless you.
Good morning, Baltimore. Thank you, Bishop Thomas, for bringing us under this beautiful auspices to pay tribute to our darling, precious Elijah. Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President. Madam Secretary, Archbishop Laurie, Bishop, members of the clergy, distinguished guests who are all here for our darling Elijah. As Speaker of the House, I have the sad honor and personal privilege to bring the condolences of the entire Congress of the United States to Maya, the Cummings family, the people, the constituents of Elijah's district, people of Baltimore, to our entire country. I say that with great authority because yesterday, my friends and those of you who loved Elijah, yesterday, Maya gave us the privilege of having a celebration of Elijah's life in the capital of the United States. The first African-American lawmaker ever to serve in repose, lie in repose in the capital of the United States. It was so beautiful, and as has been referenced, Elijah brought people together in life of different parties and in his death of different parties. And that's why I'm so pleased that yesterday's service was very bipartisan. In fact, it took bipartisan agreement for Elijah to lie in repose on the same catapult that Abraham Lincoln lay in repose in the Capitol. And so today we have a very strong bipartisan of Elijah's colleagues from the House of Representatives, led by our chair of the Black Caucus, Karen Bass, our leader, Steny Hoyer, John Lewis, Marcia, who got the nod, and I'm happy to get it as well, and so many of our members of the House in a bipartisan fashion. Please rise to be recognized. And their families and their staff, Elijah's staff. John Lewis, where are you, John Lewis? And we had a strong representation from the United States Senate in a bipartisan way yesterday. Today also led by Ben Cardin and Chris Van Hollen, bringing so many senators here today. Bishop Thomas, how brilliant was it of Elijah's parents to name him Elijah? As the secretary said, the Lord, the God is my Lord. And as we know from the Old Testament, there is a tradition to leave a seat at the table for Elijah who might show up. But our Elijah always made a seat at the table for others. He made a seat at the table for children who needed an education, for even new members of Congress so that he could mentor them, for all who wanted to be part of the American dream. Elijah himself personally lived the American dream, and he wanted everyone else to have that opportunity, hence many seats at the table. How fortunate for our country that his parents also taught him to live up to his name. How blessed are we all to know him and to benefit from his friendship and his leadership. Elijah was a proud man, proud of his heritage, proud of Baltimore, and proud of America. He always appealed to our better angels and to the promise of America, calling us to live up to our principles and for a higher purpose. As he said, and this is so, all the words that we will use that are the best words, or words that Elijah used, was when we were not meeting the needs of children in our country, he said, "We are better than this." He held himself to a high standard, and that is why I've called him the North Star of Congress, our guiding light. Thank you, Maya, for giving me this opportunity to speak at the Baltimore celebration, as well as yesterday, of Elijah's life. Previously, of the House. At that time, I said this was appropriate because Elijah was master of the House. Master of the House. In his chairmanship of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, he lived up to his responsibilities to hold the federal government accountable to the laws of the land. One word I would use to describe Elijah over and over again is the word future. He was there to make the future for children, whom he called, as has been said, our living messengers to a future we will never see. But he wanted for those children to have a future worthy of their aspirations, and he wanted them to have a future built on our values, continue to be built on our values. And as a master of the house, he was also the mentor of the house. Does anybody in here be mentored by Elijah Cummings? I think so. He was no surprise that when we had this election and we won the Congress, that Elijah said, send me as many freshmen as you can because I want to help them be oriented to reach their fullest potential in the House of Representatives. So wonderful that he did that. And all members, whether new or not, benefited from the generosity of his spirit, sometimes the candor of how we do our work. Whether we asked or not, the candor was there. And again, it was an honor to share, again, some of these thoughts about our dear Elijah. Elijah loved Baltimore and his district. He was my Baltimore brother in Congress. We had our chats about Baltimore all the time. He loved and respected his constituents. By example, he gave people hope. By his courage, he fought for what is right. By his brilliance, knowledge, and legal prowess, he made a difference in so many ways, fighting for gun violence prevention, expanding opportunity for everyone, recognizing, now this was most recent, recognizing the cost of prescription drugs hurt the health and economic well-being of America's working families. He was willing to reach across the aisle, even across the Capitol, even down Pennsylvania Avenue. So it should be a source of pride to all of us who loved Elijah that the committee chairman immediately named H.R. 3, the Lower Drug Cost Act, now the Elijah E. Cummings Lower Cost Drug Act. Our Baltimore connection gave me special entree into the thinking, Elijah's thinking, which helped me as speaker. Our love of the Orioles and the Ravens made it fun. Thank you, Baltimore, for your contribution to the greatness of the United States of America. When I spoke on Wednesday at my brother Tommy D'Alessandro's service, I acknowledged that we would be honoring Elijah today. We lost two great leaders in 1 week, we did in Baltimore. One of the things that Elijah, my brother Tommy, and I, being from Baltimore, and I representing San Francisco, had in common was the pride we took in Baltimore, our Baltimore. Another thing Tommy, Elijah, and I had, and I, in representing San Francisco, had in common that our hearts are full of love for America. But I used to tell them in San Francisco, for us, love means letting other versions exist. And that's exactly what Elijah did. Respecting the views of others, reaching across the aisle, building community and consensus. Thank you, Maya. Thank you to the children and to your entire family for sharing Elijah with us and for loving him so much. You were the source of his strength and inspiration. I hope it is a comfort to you that so many people mourn your sad loss and are praying for you at this sad time. As we always pray for God to bless America, let us acknowledge that God truly blessed America with the life and legacy of Elijah E. Cummings, mentor, master of the house, North Star, Mr. Chairman, master of the house. May he rest in peace, Elijah Cummings. Thank you all so much.
Good morning. Bishop Walter Thomas, my friend. President Obama, President Clinton, Vice President Biden, Secretary of State Clinton, Governor Hogan, Mayor Jack Young, distinguished clergy and all the pulpit guests that are all over the place, and ladies and gentlemen, Maya, those of us who are Elijah's friends will forever remember him, but you will remember him the most. Every time the sun splashes on our face and warms us, we will miss Elijah, but you will miss him most. We loved him, but you would come to love him most. Please accept as you see the collective condolence of a whole host of Americans who share this moment in front of TV screens and radios, who will take this moment and teach it in schools next week, and who will share it with their own children. Our prayers go out to his siblings, to his children, to all those who were related to Elijah. You know, he said to me, now if you go before I go, don't get up there and wing it, Kwaisi. He said, write it down. And then he said, no, I mean really write it down. So here we are. Whose woods are these? I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods filled with snow. Yes, those woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. You would think that the words of Robert Frost were almost written as if he knew that Elijah would one day be among us, with his indefatigable spirit and his energy and everything he did, and how he actually lived his life as if he did have miles to go before he would decide to sleep. He could be both provocative and evocative. He found a way to capture our will to dare to be different in communities all over the country, and then challenged us to dare to make a difference. Elijah and I spent a lot of time in the last couple of years privately just talking about our own life, our own death, our own humanity, our own mortality, our own funerals, and whether he was going to go before me or I was going to go before them. And because I was 3 years older than Elijah, he liked to kind of poke at me. And I said, Elijah, based on statistics, I'll probably be leaving here before you. And he would say, dude, I hear they're rather filled up downstairs where you're going, so you may have to get in line. Sometimes out of the blue, he'd call me, sticking it to me. So Kwaisi, what's it like now that you turned 40? Of course, Elijah was 37. Well, what's it like when you turn 60? Of course, he was 57. We used to call each other unannounced sometimes on birthdays just to say birthday, but we didn't do it with regularity because we wanted it to be different and a surprise. And I would get those calls and enjoyed every one of them. Surprised, didn't know if he was going to call this year or 4 years later. And he would. And yesterday was my birthday, and I did not hear from my friend. I met Elijah in the spring of 1979. I was a young talk show host and had launched a campaign to run for city council. Elijah was a young lawyer and precinct marshal working with the Democratic Club headed by Senator Clarence Mitchell III and Mike Mitchell, and Delegate and soon-to-be State Senator Larry Young, and John Jeffries and Delegate Lena K. Lee. The political godfather and mentor to both Elijah and myself was, as you heard Nancy speak earlier, about the revered Congressman Perrin J. Mitchell. It was both It was both the Mitchell family and the Cole Murphy family of the Afro-American newspaper that really moved our communities along. They organized, they directed us on politics, on inclusion, how to fight for rights, both civil and political. And so Elijah sat at parents' feet, and I sat at his feet. And we listened and we learned, and we began to get involved, going all the way back to the campaign of Hubert Humphrey, when neither of us knew what we were doing except passing out bumper stickers that said, "Vote for Humphrey." Elijah was being brought along and tutored, as I said, by the Mitchell Club. I was being brought along and tutored by the late State Senator Verda Welcome, who was the first black woman in America ever to be elected to a state senate. So despite those organizational allegiances, Elijah and I became political buddies right away. We were both eager to just find a way to strike out and to change the system that had maintained discriminatory practices in housing and in education and in employment and healthcare as it worked to deny political power. He was attracted to my grassroots campaign in '79 to run for the city council with no money at all. And I knew and he knew, even though he didn't say it and we didn't discuss it at that time, that one day Elijah, in the not too distant future, would be running for himself. I would go on later that year to get elected to the city council, winning by 3 votes. And Elijah, who had met my grandmother, thought it was funny. They came to me and said, "Now, Kwesi, as long as you are black," which meant the rest of my life, you just remember those 3 votes were the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and you can't go wrong. Now, although it would be chronologically correct, Bishop, to suggest that that's how Elijah got started, it would be a gross understatement of where he really began. That shaping and that beginning started in the home of Robert and Ruth Cummings, where young Elijah learned the basics of life. He was taught to work hard, play by the rules, love your country, cherish your faith, respect your elderly. It was what they poured into him that began to shine through him for the rest of his life. It was an uncompromising understanding of who he was and whose he would forever be. And I don't know that in the many years we've known each other that Elijah ever gave a speech around me or had a conversation with me where he did not mention his mother or his father and the lessons of humility that gave him strength. I remember kneeling beside him at his mother's funeral service. Elijah was in a wheelchair. I kneeled down and touched the back of his hand, and he gripped my hand as he was gripping also on the edge of that wheelchair, just a few feet from his mother's coffin. And although you could look in his eyes that day and see the enormous sense of loss, you could always sense that at that moment that her spirit had entered into him. And he squeezed my hand and he just pointed to her like that, through his tears and through his smiles. Throughout our years together, when I served in the Congress and then later when he served in the Congress, we would often remind one another that this is not a perfect nation and that we are not perfect people, but that God calls all of us in America to a perfect mission. Elijah believed it and he lived it. He was the 20th century manifestation of a race of people who had suffered, endured, and survived. 3 centuries of slavery, oppression, deprivation, degradation, denial, and disprivilege. Thrust from his mother's womb as he was in the middle of an evolving civil rights movement, a movement of Black Renaissance, and like many of us were buoyed by the revolutionary talent of that day. Intisaka Shange, Gil Scott-Heron, the last poets, Nikki Giovanni, Hakeem Mahabuti, Sonia Sanchez, and so many others. And through it all, he realized that the road less traveled was, in fact, the one less certain but that's the one he knew that he would be on anyway. You know, every day Elijah saw his faith around him, because there was this mystery he used to tell me all around me, Kwaisi. I can't explain it through the usual methodologies of science, whether it is the instinctiveness of the bumblebee or the orderliness of the cosmos. I have to have the faith to believe in what others see as being impossible. And he would repeat that. He would repeat the poet and say, I shall not shout my faith. 3 times eloquent are the quiet trees and the glistening sod. Hushed are the stars, whose power is never spent. He said, the mills and the hills are mute, and yet they speak of God. And so I believe and I respectfully and submit to you that we use this occasion, this passage, another place, to recommit ourselves to sharing Elijah's dream. It was also the dream of Martin Luther King and Fannie Lou Hamer, the dream of Du Bois and Washington and Tubman and Douglas, the dream of all those nameless and faceless sharecroppers of his father's generation who laid their bodies down on plantations all over this country so that young Elijahs could run across them and get to the promised land. They couldn't always speak the King's English. They didn't have college degrees. They had to steal away to pray, but they never believed that they would ever give up and waver on the trust and belief they had in their children. They grew up. They became leaders, and they are who we celebrate. His sacrifices and achievements remind us, students, that Cravell was right when he said that no daring is fatal, that Sartre was right when he said the maximum hope would always lie closest to the maximum danger, that Dr. King was right, Elijah, when he said for the true believers, the darkness would be light enough. So how do we celebrate him today? How do we honor him as we get ready to recommit his soul and spirit back to God? Not by trinkets or false praise or ceremony or adoration. Those things never meant anything to Elijah. We honor him instead by holding on to his example